Tonight, investigators now saying the co-pilot intentionally crashed that German jetliner into the French Alps, killing 150 people. Could the airline be liable if and when family members decide to look for culpability? Then, Bo Bergdahl is now facing 2 federal charges after he left his post and was captured by the Taliban. We will try the case right here and try to determine whether he's already paid the price or, in fact, he should go to prison. Also, several days after the wrong-way crash in Staten Island killed 2 people, the driver, a police officer, is just now being asked for his blood to test for alcohol. The question is, if you or I did the same thing, we get tested right there on the spot. Good evening and welcome to RFL. I am Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us. And tonight our show, it is all, as we do here usually Wednesdays, but today or this week on Wednesdays, it's about the law. Now, first in the docket, shocking new information that came out today about that Germanwings plane crash. Prosecutors are saying now that the co-pilot intentionally crashed the plane while the pilot was locked out, and pleading and banging on the door to get back in the cockpit, obviously to no avail. But they are saying there's no signs right now of terrorism, and they did identify the co-pilot as Andreas Lubitz, a 27-year-old German citizen. And we asked earlier today Mike Danko, who's an attorney specializing in aviation charges, what he makes of this. And he told us in part that the airline industry does a poor job of screening pilots for mental health issues. Pilots, they have to pass a physical exam at least once a year, and they will be asked about their mental health during the exam, but that's the extent of the screening. And this got me to thinking about the families right now. Now, it's bad enough if there was an accident, whether it was a mechanical failure on the plane or there was a storm or whatever else. And even terrorism, as horrific as that is, that's an external force that did it. But if it's intentional, and then imagine it's from the folks that you entrusted your safety to, one of the pilots on there employed by the airline, well, as painful as it was for all involved, it then becomes that much more, I would think, both frustrating as well as even maddening. And it has us wondering where the law will come into this. And I want to get to our panel right now. Jim Kasuris, a criminal defense attorney in Manhattan, sitting on the board of directors for the New York City Criminal Bar Association, frequently lecturing at New York Law School and the bar associations in both Queens and New York City. And he's also a visiting professor at the University of Birmingham in England. Doug Von Noist, a founding partner of Karsten Von Noist, focusing on corporate misconduct and selected by the Legal 500 as one of the most influential trial lawyers in the country. Mayo Bartlett, an attorney at the law offices of Mayo Bartlett PLLC and a former chief of the Bias Crimes Unit at the Westchester County District Attorney's Office, and Mark Furnish, a professor of Brooklyn law. He's also argued before the U.S. Supreme Court as well, and we will talk about the High Court a little bit later in the program. All right, guys, but let's start. I'll start with you, Jimmy, to my left, about what we learned today. And just from a visceral level, when you heard that it was intentional, and whether it was terrorist or not, doesn't appear that there's any signs that there was. It doesn't even seem to be any indication that this was even forecastable nonetheless. The fact that it happened by someone under the employ, and the fact that even protocols on the plane, now maybe in Germany and European nations individually can have different policies about having 1 or 2 pilots alone in the cockpit, but nonetheless, we have protocols here post 9/11 where that wouldn't have been permitted, to leave one person alone in there, let alone who can and can't get access to that. It begs the question, at least to me, what should the expectation be of a person who purchases a ticket on that airline as to what safety they should reasonably expect from the airline?
The last words you stated are the operable words, reasonably expected. And you can reasonably expect your host to take appropriate precautions in terms of screening the people that they allow to fly their planes, making sure that these protocols are followed. It makes sense from every standpoint, be it terrorism or be it another pilot who gets into trouble and he either falls asleep or he gets sick, that there's always access for that pilot to have gotten back into the area. So my visceral reaction is, when I'm going to trust an airline to allow me to get on a plane, that somebody they are allowing to fly the plane is going to fly the plane, that they've screened that person and done what they could reasonably to ensure my safety.
You know, Doug, this morning I ran into somebody who said, you know, I'm flying out next week with my family. This is one more thing I got to worry about right now. But I thought about it in that it didn't seem that the airline, I don't want to presume, there's a lot of facts that we still don't know as of yet. But if the initial findings are right, and there wasn't a lot of due diligence about the guy, there seemed to be a gap in time in terms of his timeline that people are trying to dig a little bit more into. But how much could an airline really glean from somebody? How much can you predict the behavior of somebody? Apparently there was a 20-minute conversation he and the pilot had that was innocuous and was fine. And the guy went to the head, and then and all of a sudden the guy either snapped or whatever, but he locked the door, and then without any communication just took the plane into the mountainside. Again, coming back to that word reasonable, how can you read people's minds if there aren't signs that there should be warning signs?
Well, clearly if this pilot had indicated to the airline that he was, going to do something like this in the past, or, I mean, clearly there'd be certain negligence that we're talking about. But you're not really looking at that. You're looking at his mental health. Now, if this person is reporting depression, if he's reporting that he has certain problems, and they're allowing him to fly, well, then that wouldn't be reasonable in a case like this. But it is very difficult. How many times have you ever heard of a pilot actually taking a plane and intentionally crashing? It doesn't happen often. So you'd really have to look at his general mental health as opposed to
let's say there were no signs, and let's say they even had a better screening process. But we do know this much. At one point, he locked the door, he didn't put out any distress signals, pointed the nose down, and he took it straight into a mountain. Now that's insane. So does it matter whether or not he exhibited signs before as it relates to the airline's responsibility? The fact is they employed somebody who killed 150 plus people.
Well, this isn't unlike a person who drives a truck on the highway. I mean, you're looking at your employees to see whether they're doing very dangerous jobs. And so as an employer, you're responsible to know that this person's on the street, they're your employee, they have to do it safely. So you're never going to have a situation where a guy like this says, I did this on purpose and I'm going to do it. It's going to be his general mental health.
Mark, how about criminal beyond the civil? Okay, at what point we saw it with a ferry in Korea? We've seen it certainly in other cases right now. We saw it, for example, remember the Buffalo air crash where they found out these guys were working obscene hours. They weren't checking the logs. These guys were taking amphetamines to keep them awake, or whatever the case was at the time. I forget the details. The point of it was, does this possibly cross over from civil to criminal?
Well, that depends on the law of the jurisdiction during the investigation, and I don't know what happened here. Nobody knows what happened here. Candidly, I can't imagine that a subsidiary of an airline like Lufthansa would ignore flagrant warning signs such as those that you're positing, and I doubt there were such flagrant warning signs. It would be hard to fathom that anybody would deliberately retain in their employ somebody with glaring mental issues like this. And I was listening to what Doug said. The real surprising thing is that we don't see this more often, given how many planes and how many potential maniacs are flying them. I mean, flying, to some extent, is a risky sort of endeavor to begin with. So it takes a certain kind of personality, our friend Bill Ehrenwald notwithstanding, to engage in that behavior. And each time you go onto a plane, you're taking your life in your hands and placing blind faith in whoever's transporting you there. So it's stunning, really, that this doesn't happen more often.
When you heard today the headline, Mayo, that this was intentional, right? And you put your attorney hat on, what's the first thing that jumped out at you?
Well, the first thing that jumped out is that right now you have competing interests. You have people who want it to be intentional because then that means that you're going to be able to go after the airline, and then you have the airline saying it's clearly not. It's too early to know what in the world happened. There may be protocol that says that. In fact, I'd be surprised if there's not protocol that says you're supposed to lock the cabin once someone leaves, because after 9/11, that's basically standard protocol across the board. But then on the other hand, just because you lock that door doesn't mean that it's an intentional act. And people are drawing all kinds of conclusions without really very much information. They're saying, oh, well, the breathing.
Media? No.
But they're saying the breathing didn't change. Well, because the breathing didn't drastically change doesn't mean he's even conscious. He may have lapsed into unconsciousness, and it could have been an accident. So we really don't know right now. But the one thing that I would agree with basically all of my colleagues here is that as a common carrier, you have a duty to make sure that you have a screening and that you try to at least identify people who may have mental health issues or may not be fit for another reason. Perhaps you may not be able to maintain consciousness at altitude even. You may be perfectly fine and fit mentally. But if there's something about you that prevents you from being a good pilot or a good conductor on a train, or you shouldn't be driving, I'd want to know whether the person had, how many hours has this person been flying that day?
Yeah.
You know, those are all things you need to know.
Well, Mayo said he agreed with all of you. That's going to end when we come back here. And even if they don't want to, we're forcing disagreement. When we come back, Bo Bergdahl, a name you may remember. Yes, he, the soldier, went AWOL and then spent years under the Taliban thumb here. He is facing possible life in prison as he's fighting 2 federal charges because he left his post in Afghanistan. But since he spent 5 years in captivity at the hands of the Taliban, has this guy been punished enough? We're going to hear both sides of that argument from the panel. Stay with us.